The funeral should have been quiet, but Robert Carter's loyal dog barked wildly at his coffin, refusing to calm down. What began as grief quickly turned into suspicion when Detective Jack Miller uncovered secrets Robert had hidden secrets powerful men would kill to protect. A web of betrayal stretched from family ties to the highest office in town. Who was pulling the strings, and could loyalty outlast corruption? Stay until the end to see how truth survived against impossible odds. If this story captures you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more gripping tales. The chapel at Whitfield & Sons Funeral Home held its breath, the way old houses do when winter refuses to leave a hush under soft lights, the woody scent of polish and lilies. The quiet murmur of a hymn played a touch too slow. Robert Carter lay in a walnut coffin at the front, polished, respectful final. Rows of townspeople filled the pews with hats in hands, shoulders squared, the kind of posture people use when they are trying to carry more than their share of weight. Near the aisle, Duke, a sable-backed German shepherd with clouding eyes and a scar along his right leg, sat pressed against the knee of Detective Jack Miller. Jack kept a firm hand over Duke's chest, feeling the dog's breathing climb and shudder as if something in the air pressed back. Jack had known Robert for 20 years, long enough to remember the sound of his laugh and the careful way he folded the map before every search and rescue call. He looked older today than he had yesterday. Grief did that, widening the roads in a man's face. Linda Carter sat in the front pew, a black dress too simple for the life she had built, with Robert, hands folded around a tissue that refused to hold. She stared at the flag draped along the foot of the coffin, as if making a pact with it not to tremble. The funeral director, Mr. Whitfield, a silver-haired man with a practiced voice, moved like a slow river through the aisle and thanked everyone for coming. Behind Linda, her sister Susan Blake rubbed her shoulder and whispered comfort. From the side door, Mayor Frank Dalton stood with a solemn jaw, and beside him the county commissioner Henry Wallace held his hat in both hands. Cameras weren't welcome inside. This was not that sort of send-off, so what remained were the sounds ordinary people bring to a funeral. A cough politely swallowed, a throat cleared, a hymn line hummed, because the next one won't come. Duke's ears tipped forward all at once. The dog had served alongside Robert in search and rescue teams, had learned to listen to the earth as if it held secrets. His body tense now, he let out a low, soil-deep rumble that slid through the hymn and made heads lift. Jack's palm pressed firmer. "Easy, Duke," he whispered, voice a notch above the organ. The dog's rumble softened, but his stare pinned the coffin like a held breath. Mr. Whitfield nodded to the minister, who began speaking of legacy, of service, of how a man's last act is not his last if he has given his town something to stand on. Linda blinked and looked down, then reached for the small square of Duke's old bandana folded in her purse. She had kept it from a day when Robert and Duke had pulled a lost boy out of a ravine at dusk. She carried it like a promise that the world could still be found. The minister's words told on steady and tender, and Jack let the rhythm hold him until Duke rose without warning, muscles coiling as if memory had taken command. Jack breathed, but the dog was already moving one step, then another shoulder against Jack's knee, then past it, then into the aisle. The sound of claws on wood was a small thunder. People drew in, hands half raised. The organist's hands faltered on the keys, and then Duke barked. It wasn't loud so much as absolute, a clean stroke through the room that cut the hymn in two. Linda startled a soft cry in her throat. Susan moved to stand, then thought better of it. Her fingers splayed as if to catch Linda should she fall. Mayor Dalton's eyebrows climbed, and Commissioner Wallace's mouth tightened in the kind of smile that doesn't belong at a funeral. Mr. Whitfield stepped forward, hands spread as if calming a skittish horse. "Detective Miller," he said gently, "perhaps the animal could be taken." Duke's second bark answered for them both. Deeper, more insistent, the kind of sound Jack had heard from him only when the wind shifted toward danger on a distant ridge. It seemed to ricochet inside the chapel off the varnished wood and the beveled glass frames of old photographs on the back wall. Jack moved quickly, taking Duke's collar in both hands, kneeling so his eyes were level with the dog's. "Buddy," he said, keeping his voice low. I know, pal. Come on, sit, right here." Duke's body trembled, but he sat tail a tense line, eyes fixed on the coffin's seam where lid met shell. Jack felt a tightened drum in his own ribs. He'd seen dogs mourn before he'd seen them curl beside beds and press their faces into the clothing left on chairs. But this felt like alert, not grief. The minister paused and, gracious in uncertainty, shifted to a prayer. Susan leaned closer to Linda and murmured, "He misses Robert. That's all it is." Linda nodded, because her heart needed that to be true. The prayer ended. In the hush after Amen, an older woman 3 pews back lifted her hand as if asking to speak. People turned in that gentle way small towns do when courtesy is muscle memory. Jack recognized her Helen Price, a retired nurse who had served everyone from rodeo cowboys to school teachers through 3 hospitals and a hospice unit. Helen did not stand. She looked at Mr. Whitfield and spoke without raising her voice. "It was sealed awful fast," she said, and the words ordinary as kitchen sugar fell into the room like a stone into a still pond. Mr. Whitfield blinked. "I beg your pardon, Ms. Price. I mean the sealing," she answered. "It's not my first funeral, son. I was here when my herald went, and for 3 of my brothers. This one was closed up sooner than I've ever seen." Papers signed while the ink was hardly dry. Susan shifted. Linda turned toward Helen, eyes bright, searching that calm face for something to hang on to. Wallace glanced at Mr. Whitfield, and for a blink the commissioner's careful expression thinned, then settled again. Jack felt the ripple move through the chapel, the soft shared lift of doubt. A whisper passed hand to hand without a sound. He spoke gently to Helen. "You mean between Mr. Carter's passing and today? I mean between him coming in and them saying no more viewing," she replied. "I sat with Linda in that little room. Seemed like hardly an hour, Mr. Whitfield clasped his hands. "There are circumstances sometimes that require a expedited process," Wallace offered smoothly as if supplying a line in a play. "It can be a kindness." The funeral director's face tightened into apology that was more professional than personal. Jack looked at Linda. "Did you request a closed casket?" Her mouth trembled, then steadied. "They told me it would be best." She breathed in slow and careful. "I didn't want Robert remembered for anything except the way he lived." Duke surged to his feet again, a short push that strained Jack's hold. He didn't bark this time. He pressed forward, nose testing the air, the kind of deliberate sampling he did when the world whispered of something that didn't belong. Jack stood with him and shifted toward the aisle to block any sudden lunge. Mr. Whitfield moved between the dog and the coffin, palms up. "Please," he said softly. "Mrs. Carter is under enough strain, and I am grateful," Linda managed, voice thin but respectful to everyone for their care. She set a hand against her chest right above her heart and looked at Duke as if he were the only creature who could read her pulse. The organist began again a different hymn, something about shelter and storms. People's heads bowed, but the air had changed. A thread had been pulled, and the hem of certainty no longer held. Jack felt it like a draft along the floorboards. He had come today to grieve a man he admired, to stand beside a woman who had loved without conditions, and to keep Duke from unraveling under the heavy strangeness of final partings. He had not come to investigate. Yet here it was, smaller than a lead, bigger than a hunch, the dog's insistence and Helen Price's steady eyes. He scanned the room. Mayor Dalton's gaze was fixed on the flag. Commissioner Wallace had taken a half-step back toward the side door, speaking to no one the way a man will when he is measuring exits. Susan had leaned close to Linda, whispering the practical questions families ask in the hour they'd rather not live through. Who will carry the flowers? Did you bring your coat? Can I call the house and turn on the porch light so it won't be dark when we return? The minister's voice rose. Love bears all things. Duke let out a breath, almost a sigh, and settled on his haunches again, his shoulder warm against Jack's leg. Jack rested his hand on the dog's neck and tried to borrow Duke's patience. He told himself he was reading grief, where there was only grief. He told himself funerals make patterns out of nothing because the heart cannot stand chaos. Still, he kept his eyes on the place that held everyone's attention, the coffin's seam, and promised himself he'd ask Mr. Whitfield quietly how the morning had run. The service moved toward its end with the kind of dignity small towns are good at. The hymn closed. The minister invited friends to speak, and they did a fishing buddy a neighbor who remembered a repaired fence in a February wind, a boy now grown who had once been lost in the woods and led out by a dog with a ruff like a winter coat. Linda stood to thank them. Her voice did not shake. Robert believed she said that a man should leave a place better than he found it. She looked at Duke and almost smiled. And that a good dog is God's way of reminding us not to give up. The words found a home inside the hush. Outside, a late winter light pressed against the stained glass, and the pine outside the window scraped one branch along the pane with a sound soft as a fingernail on paper. Jack felt the day divide before and after a dog's bark, before and after a nurse's steady observation. He didn't yet know what it meant. Only that something had nudged them a half-inch toward a different truth than the one they had expected to live with. When the pallbearers rose and the aisle opened, Duke rose too poised and unwilling as if he understood better than any of them that love held to a box is not the same as letting go. After the funeral service ended and the townspeople began filing slowly toward the reception hall, where coffee and sandwiches waited, Jack Miller kept his steps measured beside Linda Carter, who held Susan's arm lightly but with a stiffness that betrayed the strain she carried. Duke walked ahead on a short leash, pausing often, sniffing the corridor as if it carried traces no one else could sense. The conversations around them were subdued, filled with polite memories, and the kind of phrases people used when trying to soften the jagged edge of grief. Jack guided Linda to a quiet alcove near the side door where the light from the stained glass shifted against the polished floor. He offered her a chair and lowered his own voice so that the noise of footsteps would cover their words. She sat carefully, holding her purse tightly as though it were the last piece of solid ground she could claim. For a long moment she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the folded flag that lay across her lap. Then, in a tone that seemed almost apologetic, she whispered that Robert had complained of feeling drugged in the final days before his death. Jack leaned forward, asking gently what she meant, and Linda explained that Robert had returned home 3 nights before his collapse, pale and unsettled, and told her he felt as if his coffee or tea had been tampered with. He laughed it off in front of her, saying it was probably just fatigue from long hours. But later she heard him retching in the bathroom, and found him gripping the sink with hands that shook. He had promised to see the department physician, but the next morning he dismissed the idea, saying he would push through because people depended on him. Linda pressed the tissue harder into her palm and admitted she had tried to speak with Dr. Emily Rhodes after Robert passed, hoping for clarity, but was told Dr. Rhodes had not been asked to examine the body. Instead, a junior assistant signed the certificate with a single line declaring natural causes. Jack listened intently, his mind already stitching threads between the dog's relentless barking, Helen Price's observation, and now this unsettling revelation. He asked if Robert had mentioned anyone he suspected, but Linda shook her head, saying he never accused anyone by name, only muttered that something was not right. Jack nodded slowly, telling her she had done right by speaking up. He promised her he would quietly look into the matter, not as a detective assigned, but as a friend of Robert's who owed him a debt. Linda's eyes welled gratitude mixed with fear, and she touched Duke's head as if drawing courage from the dog's steady warmth. As the reception drew to a close and mourners left with heavy handshakes, Jack excused himself to find Dr. Emily Rhodes. He located her near the parking lot, her white coat folded over her arm, speaking quietly with another physician. She greeted Jack with respectful reserve, and when he asked about the report, she frowned, confirming she had been told her services were unnecessary. According to her, Robert's case was presented as straightforward a sudden heart failure in a man of his age, nothing requiring deeper inquiry. She admitted this decision puzzled her since Robert's last medical exam had shown him in excellent health. She also noted she had seen irregularities in the paperwork. The signatures belonged to an assistant who rarely handled such matters, someone likely pressured to expedite the process. Jack asked if she could review the body even now, but she explained the window had already passed since embalming had begun and access would require authorization she did not expect to receive. He thanked her nonetheless, telling her to remain alert in case anything changed. Driving home with Duke in the passenger seat, Jack felt the weight of a knot tightening inside him. Robert Carter had been more than a colleague. He had been a compass in a profession that sometimes lost its way. Jack remembered being a young recruit reckless and angry, and how Robert had spoken to him quietly after a failed case, not with reprimand, but with belief, reminding him that integrity was worth protecting even when evidence seemed scarce. That memory hardened Jack's resolve now. If Robert had been silenced by more than fate, then silence from Jack would be betrayal. Back at his house, the quiet pressed heavy. He poured water into Duke's bowl and set his jacket across the chair. Duke paced near the window ears, flicking with restless vigilance before lying down with a sigh. Jack sat at his desk, reviewing the notes he had scribbled, sealed too soon, complaints of being drugged. Rhodes sidelined. The picture forming was faint but undeniable. He knew the next step had to be discretion, for pressing too hard could alert whoever had forced this outcome. He considered the possibilities poison disguised as medicine, a drink laced over days' pressure from inside the department, or even higher. He knew Robert had been digging into cases that touched not just street-level crime, but financial records reaching city contracts. Jack reached for the phone, hesitated, then set it down. For now, he could trust only Duke Linda, and perhaps Dr. Rhodes. Anything wider risked alerting the wrong ears. He rubbed his temples, feeling the day's shadows deepen. Outside, the town moved on as if one man's passing were simply another page, but Jack felt certain this page was the opening to a darker chapter. That night, after a day heavy with condolences and unanswered questions, Jack Miller returned to the funeral home with Duke at his side, determined to keep watch over Robert Carter's coffin. The director, Mr. Whitfield, had expressed mild surprise when Jack requested to remain overnight, but the man recognized the weight of respect and did not refuse him. Linda Carter had already gone home with her sister Susan, worn from the day's grief, and Dr. Emily Rhodes had promised to review what little paperwork she could access. Jack understood the quiet hours ahead would not be easy, but he trusted his instincts and the sharper instincts of the dog who had already seen too much. The corridors of Whitfield & Sons after midnight carried a different sound, as though the walls had settled into a deeper silence. Jack chose a chair near the viewing room, positioning himself where he could see the coffin while keeping Duke close. A single lamp cast an amber glow across the polished floor, while outside rain tapped gently against the tall windows, steady and insistent like a hand reminding him of unfinished business. Duke lay down but remained alert, head lifted, ears pricked. Jack tried to steady his thoughts by recalling the chain of events, Robert's sudden decline, Linda's whispered confession about his suspicion of being drugged, and the troubling fact that Dr. Rhodes had been prevented from conducting a proper examination. Each piece pushed Jack further from acceptance of natural death and closer to the belief that foul play had crept into Robert's final days. Near 1 in the morning, as the rain strengthened, Duke stiffened and released a low growl that rose from his chest like a warning bell. Jack felt the vibration through the leash and stood quietly, eyes scanning the dim room. He listened for movement beyond the rainfall and soon caught the faint scrape of a shoe against the floor near the far corner. His hand instinctively moved toward the holster beneath his jacket, though he did not draw the weapon yet. Instead, he called into the shadows, his voice calm but firm, identifying himself as a detective and asking the unseen presence to step forward. A figure emerged slowly, a man of medium height with a dark overcoat and a hat pulled low, his face partly shadowed. He lifted his hands in a gesture of peace and apologized softly for startling Jack. He explained that he was an old friend of Robert's, someone who had heard of his passing and wanted a private moment to say goodbye. Jack kept his posture steady, though every instinct warned him the story rang thin. He asked for the man's name, and the stranger offered it smoothly, Charles Morton, claiming he and Robert had served together years earlier on a county task force. Jack studied him in silence, his detective's habit noting the crisp way the stranger stood, the careful tone of his voice, and most of all the way his eyes flicked repeatedly toward the coffin as though measuring distance. Duke's growl deepened sharp enough to echo against the wood paneling. Jack commanded the dog to stay, but did not loosen his grip on the leash. He asked the visitor which unit he had supposedly served in with Robert, but the man offered vague recollections, deflecting specifics with talk of shared values and brotherhood. Jack pressed further, asking what Robert's favorite saying had been during those long operations. The man faltered, offering only a smile that did not reach his eyes. Duke surged forward suddenly, muscles taut, barking with force that shattered the stillness of the viewing room. The stranger stepped back quickly, lifting his hands higher, his polished shoes sliding against the tile. He stammered that perhaps it was not the right time, that grief made memories slippery, and that he should return another day when the widow was present. Without waiting for further questions, he turned and moved swiftly toward the side exit. Jack called after him, instructing him to stop, but the man ignored the command, pushing open the heavy door and vanishing into the storm outside. Duke lunged forward, straining against the leash, barking into the night as if the darkness itself carried threat. Jack held him back, unwilling to risk losing control of the situation without backup. He stood there for a long moment, heart-pounding rain scent drifting in from the open doorway. When he finally closed the door and secured the bolt, he realized how quickly the calm of the vigil had been broken. He wrote notes immediately, recording the description of the man, his false claim, and his hasty departure. Duke remained restless, circling near the coffin nose pressed to the seam of the lid, whines rising in between bursts of low growls. Jack placed a hand on the dog's shoulder, whispering steady words, but his own certainty grew sharper. Whoever that visitor truly was, he had not come to grieve. He had come to confirm something, perhaps to ensure Robert remained untouched, perhaps to silence the last trace of a man who had lived by integrity. The night stretched on, with Jack unable to shake the sense that this was only the beginning of a longer battle. He watched the coffin with new suspicion, aware that within its sealed frame might lie more than sorrow. Outside, the rain did not stop. Morning light washed over Whitfield and Sons' funeral home with a pale gray tone that matched Jack Miller's unsettled thoughts after the night's intrusion. He had spent hours replaying the stranger's hurried exit, the false story of shared service, and Duke's unshakable fury toward the coffin itself. When Linda Carter arrived early with Susan by her side, Jack approached her quietly and explained what had transpired, omitting none of the details. Her face drained of color, but she stood straighter, insisting that if there were shadows over Robert's death, they must be lifted now. With her consent, Jack pressed Mr. Whitfield to allow the coffin to be opened under proper supervision. The director hesitated, fearing scandal and the breaking of solemn tradition, yet the widow's request could not be denied, and so the task was arranged. Dr. Emily Rhodes was called at once, and she arrived with her medical bag, her eyes sharp with professional focus. Duke waited near the coffin, his body tense but his barking stilled, as if he knew the moment had come for revelation rather than noise. Jack stood close to Linda as the brass clasps were released one by one, the heavy lid lifting with a groan that seemed louder than the storm of the night before. When the interior lay visible, silence held the room. Robert Carter's body rested in uniform hands folded neatly, the flag carefully placed at his side. Yet Dr. Rhodes leaned in and frowned. She pointed to the skin along his neck where a faint puncture mark lingered just below the collar line. Another similar mark showed along his arm, subtle enough to escape a casual glance but unmistakable to trained eyes. She explained in a low voice that these were not consistent with embalming procedures. Jack felt the air thicken as Linda pressed a hand to her mouth. The discovery validated every doubt, every whisper of suspicion that had built since the funeral began. Dr. Rhodes began documenting the findings, carefully sketching diagrams in her notes. Jack asked if the marks suggested injections, and she confirmed, adding that without toxicology, they could not be certain what had been delivered, but the placement implied deliberate intent rather than medical necessity. Duke whined softly and pressed his nose toward Robert's chest, as though urging further search. Jack leaned closer and adjusted the edge of Robert's jacket. Something resisted a stiffness beyond fabric. He reached carefully into the inner lining and found a small, square bulge stitched within. With Dr. Rhodes's nod, he used a pocket knife to slit the seam gently. Out slid a plastic-wrapped microdrive, no larger than a thumbnail, concealed as if Robert had known danger followed him. Jack held it up for Linda to see. Her eyes widened with both grief and renewed strength. She whispered that Robert had spent nights locked in his study scribbling notes, and she had often asked what he worked on, but he always assured her it was better she did not know. Jack placed the drive in an evidence bag, sealing it with deliberate care. He promised Linda that he would review its contents only in the presence of trusted hands, not through official channels that might already be compromised. Dr. Rhodes urged them to be discreet, warning that whoever arranged Robert's death would not hesitate to act again if they learned evidence had been found. Jack nodded, the weight of the discovery settling like a stone in his chest. He asked Linda to remain guarded in her words, even with family, and she agreed, her grief giving way to a fiercer resolve. Susan stood nearby, her expression unreadable, her arms folded tightly. Duke returned to the side of the coffin and lay down, his head resting on his paws but his eyes never closing. Jack recognized the signal in the dog's posture: vigilance, not rest. As the coffin was closed again, Jack made arrangements to escort Linda home, promising she would not be left vulnerable. He tucked the evidence bag securely into his jacket and felt the sharp edge of its plastic press against his ribs, a reminder of the responsibility now his to bear. Outside, the sky remained gray, the rain having eased to a steady drizzle. He knew the drive would hold answers, perhaps not all, but enough to point them forward. He also knew that possession of it made them targets. As he walked Linda and Susan to their car, Duke at his side, Jack caught a glimpse of a black sedan parked half a block away, its engine idling, though no driver stepped out. The car pulled away slowly as soon as he turned his gaze toward it. His hand brushed the evidence bag again, and his jaw set. Robert Carter had not left this world in peace, but he had left a message stitched close to his heart. Now it was up to those who loved him, both man and dog, to ensure the truth saw daylight. Jack Miller spent the next morning in his office at the Riverside Police Department, his desk crowded with files and the small evidence bag containing Robert Carter's hidden drive locked firmly in his top drawer. He had not yet opened the contents, waiting for the right moment and the right place, but the knowledge of it weighed heavily on him. Duke rested by the door, lifting his head each time footsteps passed his ears, twitching as if measuring intent from sound alone. The station was quieter than usual, a hush that followed the chief's funeral and the uncertainty of leadership. Deputy Chief Tom Briggs had stepped into temporary authority with a calm face and steady voice. but Jack noticed something in his tone that felt rehearsed. Later that afternoon, while reviewing incident logs, Jack caught wind of unusual activity in the digital archive room. A patrol officer mentioned offhand that Briggs had requested full access to Robert Carter's open cases, insisting he needed to close them quickly for the record. Jack's instincts flared. He walked the narrow hall toward the archive, Duke padding silently beside him, and pushed the door open without knocking. Inside, Tom Briggs sat at the terminal, his shoulders, tight fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. The screen displayed a file index with Robert's name scattered across multiple entries. Jack watched as line after line vanished under Briggs's keystrokes, entire case histories dissolving from existence. Briggs jumped at the sound of the door, then turned with a forced smile. "Just housekeeping," he said lightly, making sure we streamline. Jack kept his voice level, asking why a deputy chief would personally handle clerical deletions that were usually left to administrative staff. Briggs's explanation stumbled, claiming confidentiality, yet his eyes avoided Jack's steady stare. Duke growled low, the sound rumbling into the silence. Jack stepped forward, closing the distance until he could see the sweat gathering at Briggs's temple. He asked what exactly required erasing from Robert's files. Briggs straightened, asserting authority, insisting Jack should return to his own assignments. Jack leaned closer and told him plainly that Robert's work would not vanish under his watch. Briggs's jaw tightened, but he offered no answer, only shutting down the screen and brushing past with a stiff nod. Jack remained in the archive, noting how the logs recorded the deletions and quietly copied the system's backup records onto a flash drive. The evidence of tampering was clear. That evening, Jack drove to Linda Carter's home to update her carefully. Susan opened the door, her smile polite yet strained. Linda sat in the living room with a blanket over her lap, relief crossing her face when Jack explained that Robert's files had not been lost entirely thanks to the backups. He reassured her that Robert's work still lived, but the attempt to erase it confirmed the danger. Susan lingered near the window, arms folded, gaze turned outward. Duke moved toward her nose, lifting as if catching something in the air. Later, as Jack prepared to leave, a neighbor walked by and greeted him, then casually mentioned seeing Susan in town the night before, stepping out of a diner booth with Tom Briggs. The words froze Jack mid-step. He turned slowly to Susan, asking if it were true. Susan hesitated only briefly, then admitted she had spoken with Tom about practical matters, claiming he offered comfort and advice in Robert's absence. Linda looked at her sister with surprise, asking why she had not mentioned it. Susan shrugged, insisting it was nothing, but her face colored under the weight of the revelation. Jack measured her tone carefully, noting the defensive edge. He reminded her that any connection to Briggs now carried risk, given his actions at the station. Susan protested that she had no idea of his involvement in anything improper, that she had only sought someone familiar in a time of loss. Linda said nothing more, though her eyes lingered on Susan with a mixture of disappointment and hurt. Jack left the house with Duke, the evening air thick with unease. He could not ignore the link between Susan and Briggs, nor the possibility that information might already be leaking too close to Linda. He resolved to keep Robert's drive secured elsewhere before more eyes turned toward it. As he drove, he noticed a car following at a distance, its headlights dimmed until he turned suddenly onto a side street, and the vehicle continued straight. The pursuit unsettled him, further proof that suspicion had grown beyond coincidence. By the time he reached his own house, Jack felt the case shifting under his feet. Betrayal had found its way not just into the department, but perhaps into Robert's own family circle. He placed the evidence drive in a secondary safe beneath his floorboards and sat heavily in his chair, Duke pressing close at his side. He knew the storm had only begun. The evening after confronting Susan Blake's connection with Tom Briggs, Jack Miller decided it was no longer safe to delay securing Robert Carter's condition. Linda had revealed in private that Robert's body had been kept under hospital observation, rather than moved to final rest, a decision she had made at the urging of Dr. Emily Rhodes after the discovery of injection marks. Rhodes believed Robert might have been placed into a state that mimicked death, and although the odds were slight, she convinced Linda to allow specialized monitoring. The hospital maintained discretion, registering Robert under an alias to prevent curious eyes. Jack understood the necessity of vigilance and volunteered to join Linda and Susan for a visit, bringing Duke along. When they arrived, the hallways of Riverside General were hushed, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows across polished tile. A small team of trusted staff escorted them to a secure wing where Robert lay connected to machines that hummed and pulsed their steady rhythms, giving faint assurance of life clinging at the edge. Linda sat beside the bed, holding his hand tenderly, whispering words of devotion even though his eyes remained closed. Susan stood back, her face pale, and Jack kept near the door with Duke at his feet, watching every person who passed with cautious eyes. Dr. Rhodes checked the monitors, reporting that Robert's vitals were fragile but present. She urged quiet and calm, emphasizing that stability mattered more than any sudden intervention. Jack asked if foul play could still reach them here, and Rhodes admitted she trusted few beyond the small circle already present. The answer settled like a chill in Jack's chest. Near midnight, as a storm outside battered the windows with wind-driven rain, the hospital lights flickered, dimmed, and then cut out completely. An audible gasp rose from the few nurses in the ward. Emergency generators should have activated at once, but instead there was a strange pause. A hollow silence broken only by the slowing beeps of Robert's monitors. Linda clutched his hand tighter, her voice trembling as she called for help. Dr. Rhodes rushed to the machines, tapping keys, adjusting cables, but the screens remained dark. Panic hovered just behind her controlled tone as she ordered manual ventilation prepared. Jack drew his flashlight and scanned the hallway, nerves sharp. He felt Duke press against his leg muscles, stiff ears trained forward. A sound carried through the darkness, the faint creak of shoes on linoleum, purposeful and measured. Jack raised the beam of light, catching the outline of a man in medical scrubs and mask pushing a cart swiftly toward Robert's room. At first glance, he appeared legitimate, but something in the haste of his stride and the way his hands gripped the cart betrayed intent. Jack stepped into the hall, demanding identification. The man mumbled a name muffled by the mask, claiming to be with emergency response, holding up a gloved hand to shield his eyes from the flashlight. Jack's instincts screamed otherwise. Before he could move, Duke surged forward, pulling the leash from Jack's hand. Teeth bared a growl rolling from his chest. The dog leapt against the cart, knocking it sideways, and the clatter revealed a syringe hidden among supplies, the needle glinting even in the dim light. The intruder staggered back, dropping pretense, and bolted down the hallway. Jack shouted for security, while Duke pursued a few strides before Jack called him back, unwilling to risk the dog in the darkened maze of corridors. Guards arrived with flashlights giving chase, but the man vanished into stairwells as though he knew the hospital layout too well. Dr. Rhodes, meanwhile, fought to stabilize Robert manually, a nurse pumping oxygen while she reconnected backup leads. Within minutes, the machines flickered back as the secondary generator roared to life at last. The monitors beeped again, weak but steady, signaling that Robert still clung to breath. Linda collapsed in tears of relief, Susan rushing to hold her, though her hands trembled with more than grief. Jack returned to the room, adrenaline coursing, and reported the attempt. Dr. Rhodes examined the fallen syringe carefully and confirmed it contained a solution capable of stopping Robert's heart within moments. She whispered that someone powerful was determined to finish what had been started. Jack took the syringe, sealed it in a fresh evidence bag, and told Linda that Robert had just survived more than fate. He had survived a second attempt on his life. Duke sat by the bed afterward, his eyes fixed on Robert's still figure, chest rising faintly under the hiss of machinery. Jack placed a hand on the dog's back and felt the tension there, knowing Duke understood the danger as keenly as any detective. Outside, the rain pounded harder, and Jack realized that Riverside was no longer just holding a funeral. It was guarding a battlefield where the enemy had already crossed the line. The morning after the failed attempt on Robert Carter's life, Riverside General buzzed with nervous energy. Security tightened around the secure wing with uniformed officers stationed at every corner, and Dr. Emily Rhodes moving briskly between machines that hummed with fragile steadiness. Jack Miller stood in the small security office adjacent to the ward, watching Duke pace near the door, as though he too understood the gravity of the images playing across the monitors. The hospital's surveillance team had spent the early hours combing through footage from the night before. At first, the images revealed nothing more than flickering lights and shadows, until one technician slowed a segment and adjusted contrast. Jack leaned closer, heart tightening as the figure came into focus. Tom Briggs. He appeared on screen in a side corridor, not in uniform but clearly identifiable. He was speaking into a phone, his posture tense, his words half audible. The audio enhancement revealed enough to chill the room. He was receiving instructions, and the voice on the other end was not unfamiliar. The technician isolated it further, and Jack felt a cold recognition. Mayor Frank Dalton's steady drawl directed Briggs to ensure Robert Carter never drew another breath. The technician froze the frame. Dalton's voice clear in the recording. Briggs nodding silently before pocketing the phone. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breath. The mayor had stood at Robert's funeral with a hand over his heart, delivering words of honor. Now the truth cut through that image with ruthless precision. Jack ordered a secure copy made of the footage and slipped it into his evidence folder alongside the syringe from the failed attack. He knew the net was widening, but he also knew that exposure had to be handled carefully. Dalton held deep influence in Riverside, and reckless accusation could backfire without absolute proof. When Jack returned to Robert's room, he found Linda at her husband's side, whispering encouragement, though Robert remained unconscious. Susan sat nearby, her eyes downcast, her hands twisting the edge of her shawl. Duke moved toward her nose, lifting as if reading something in her silence. Jack asked her directly if she had anything more to share. At first, she shook her head, then looked away. Linda pressed gently, reminding her sister that honesty now meant survival for them all. Susan's shoulders slumped, her face pale as she admitted the truth. She confessed that her meetings with Tom Briggs had not been out of comfort or loyalty, but out of fear. Briggs had approached her weeks earlier, claiming he knew of debts her son carried and warning that harm would come to him unless she cooperated. When Linda gasped in disbelief, Susan explained that she had been told to keep track of Linda's movements and pass along harmless details. She insisted she never imagined Robert would be harmed, that she believed it was only about political maneuvering. Jack listened intently, noting the tremor in her voice, the raw edge of desperation. Susan wiped her eyes and admitted she had continued meeting Briggs even after Robert's passing because Briggs threatened that her son would be targeted next if she resisted. Linda sat frozen, torn between anger and compassion. Finally, she whispered that betrayal cut deepest when family was used as leverage. Jack asked where Susan had last seen Briggs, and she revealed the diner meeting had included veiled warnings about not trusting outsiders, words she now recognized as meant to isolate them. Jack took note, his mind racing. The circle of trust had narrowed dangerously, and now the circle of betrayal pointed toward the mayor's office itself. He reminded both women that silence was no longer safe. Dalton's involvement meant the conspiracy reached the city's highest level. Duke settled at Jack's feet, his eyes fixed on Susan with unwavering attention, as though the dog measured the truth in her confession more surely than any detective could. Jack resolved to move quickly, gathering allies beyond the town's compromised ranks, but first he would ensure Susan's son was placed under protective watch. He left the hospital that afternoon with Duke carrying the copied footage under his arm, determined to prepare for the storm that would follow. The rain had passed, but Riverside's sky still carried a heavy weight, as if it too waited for revelation. Jack Miller left Riverside General with Duke close at his side and the hospital's surveillance copy secured in his inner pocket. The evidence of Tom Briggs taking direct orders from Mayor Frank Dalton left little doubt, but it also left a deeper unease. The circle of betrayal had widened beyond what anyone in Riverside wanted to believe. By the time Jack reached his office, the storm clouds had parted, but the town's silence felt heavier than rain. He sat at his desk, staring at Robert Carter's hidden drive, the one he had recovered from the lining of the chief's jacket. He had delayed opening it for fear of compromise, but now the time had come. He loaded the micro drive into a secure laptop disconnected from the department's network. Duke rested near his chair, lifting his head each time Jack exhaled sharply. The drive held hundreds of files, financial ledgers, scanned documents, audio clips. Robert had been gathering evidence not just on street-level trafficking, but on the flow of money through city contracts. Jack's eyes narrowed when he discovered a scanned note Robert had written by hand. Bank Safe Deposit Box, First National Branch 3. Dalton. Do not trust station. Secure before meeting Reynolds. The mention of Reynolds startled him. He recalled Agent Mark Reynolds, an FBI officer who had briefly assisted on a federal firearms case 2 years earlier. Robert had evidently trusted him enough to make him part of this trail. Jack decided the next step was clear. The following morning, under the cover of routine, he walked into First National Bank with Duke at his side and a quiet determination in his step. With Robert's key recovered from his home office, Linda had provided it. Hesitantly, her hands trembling as she handed it over, Jack requested access to the safe deposit box. The banker, unaware of the storm behind the request, led him to a private chamber. Inside, Jack turned the key and pulled the long, narrow box free. He slid it open slowly. His breath held Duke's eyes fixed on his movements. Inside lay folders wrapped in brown paper, a flash drive, and a ledger bound in worn leather. Jack opened the ledger first. It was filled with handwritten entries documenting deposits and withdrawals tied to shell companies. The amounts were staggering far beyond anything that could be dismissed as clerical error. Attached receipts bore signatures connected to municipal contracts and bore one name repeatedly: Mayor Frank Dalton. The flash drive mirrored the ledger with digital copies, ensuring the evidence would survive duplication. Jack secured everything into an evidence bag and left quietly, knowing that this discovery could not be handled alone. Later that evening, he arranged a discreet meeting with Agent Reynolds at an out-of-town diner far from Riverside's political reach. Reynolds arrived in plain clothes, his expression calm but alert. Jack laid the evidence on the table, explaining the sequence of discoveries. Robert's suspicion of being drugged, the injection marks, the micro drive, the attempted sabotage at the hospital, Briggs's surveillance footage, and now the safe deposit box. Reynolds listened without interruption, then opened the ledger. His jaw tightened as he scanned the pages. When he finally spoke, his tone carried the weight of confirmation. He explained that Robert had been cooperating quietly with federal investigators, piecing together a larger scheme. The corruption did not end with Dalton. It reached into federal grant funds meant for community redevelopment. Money earmarked for rebuilding factories, schools, and treatment centers had been siphoned through shell companies, some connected to Riverside, others spread across state lines. Reynolds admitted that the case had been under federal review for months, but Robert's death, or what had been staged as death, nearly ended the trail. Jack asked why Reynolds had not stepped in sooner, and Reynolds replied that Robert had insisted on protecting his town first, ensuring the files stayed hidden until they were ready to bring the case to light. Jack leaned back, realization settling hard. Robert had carried this burden alone for months, risking silence, risking even his life. Reynolds placed a firm hand on the ledger and told Jack that what they held was no longer just local corruption. It was a thread leading into a web of embezzlement tied to federal resources. Dalton was a pawn of something larger. Jack nodded slowly, understanding that Riverside was about to become the center of an investigation that stretched far beyond its borders. Duke shifted beneath the table, his body pressed close against Jack's leg, as though grounding him in the moment. Reynolds assured Jack that protection would be arranged for Linda and Susan immediately, as well as Susan's son, who had been used as leverage. Jack exhaled, grateful but wary. He knew Dalton would not sit idle once he sensed the walls closing in. As he drove back toward Riverside that night, the roads glistening from fresh rain, Jack felt the tension coil tighter. The evidence was secure, the circle of allies widening, but the fight ahead would test every thread of loyalty left in a town already torn by betrayal. Jack Miller returned to Riverside with a renewed sense of urgency after his meeting with Agent Reynolds. The safe deposit evidence revealed Dalton's signature across layers of corruption, but Reynolds' warning weighed heavily. Dalton was not acting alone. Jack knew the mayor would soon sense his shield cracking, and desperate men made reckless choices. That evening, Jack drove past the industrial quarter on the edge of town where old factories stood silent and rusting. Smoke drifted faintly above one of the abandoned paper mills, pale against the dusk sky. Duke stirred beside him in the passenger seat, ears lifting, nose pressed against the window. Jack slowed the car. Instincts sharpened. He parked discreetly behind a row of trucks and stepped out with Duke flashlight tucked at his belt and hand resting near his holster. The air smelled of scorched paper. Duke pulled ahead, nose low to the ground, leading Jack toward the mill's side entrance. They slipped inside, boots crunching against scattered ash. The large hall glowed faintly with dying embers from metal barrels. Sheets of charred paper curled within, still smoldering. Jack sifted through the debris with a stick, finding fragments of contracts, city seals and ledgers, documents tied to the redevelopment funds Robert had traced. He realized someone had moved fast to destroy what remained. Duke growled, his body-taut gaze fixed toward the far end of the hall. Jack followed his line of sight and caught the silhouette of a man feeding another box of files into the flames. Jack raised his voice, commanding the man to stop. The figure spun, startled, then bolted toward a stairwell. Jack released Duke with a sharp command, and the German shepherd surged forward, claws striking sparks from concrete. Jack chased close behind flashlight beam, darting across rusted rails and broken windows. The man reached the upper floor, knocking over crates to block the path. Duke leapt through them with unyielding force, cornering the suspect against a locked door. Jack caught up weapon-drawn voice, steady as he ordered the man to freeze. Under the beam of light, the suspect's face was revealed one of Dalton's aides, a clerk often seen at City Hall. Sweat streaked his face as he stammered that he was only following orders. Jack pressed for a name, and the clerk blurted out Dalton's, insisting the mayor demanded all records tied to redevelopment projects be destroyed. Jack asked why Dalton would risk such exposure now, and the clerk's response twisted the night further. Dalton, he said, was never the true architect. He was simply the public face. The real control, the real orders came from Commissioner Henry Wallace. Jack froze, the words cutting deeper than he expected. Wallace, the commissioner who had stood silently at Robert's funeral, who had offered condolences with solemn dignity, was the one orchestrating the scheme. Dalton was a decoy, a convenient figure to absorb suspicion, while Wallace remained untouchable. The clerk, desperate, begged Jack for protection, saying Wallace's men would kill him if they knew he had been caught. Jack restrained him with cuffs and led him back down through the mill, Duke circling protectively. The burning barrels hissed as the last fragments of evidence turned to ash, but Jack knew the confession had shifted everything. Back at his car, Jack called Agent Reynolds, relaying the discovery. Reynolds confirmed that federal suspicion had long hovered around Wallace, but direct proof had been elusive. Dalton's involvement had always seemed too clumsy for a man of his position. Now it made sense. Wallace had used Dalton as a shield, quietly moving funds through shell accounts while Dalton played the visible role. Jack looked down at Duke, who still sniffed the air as though more threats lingered. He realized the pursuit was far from over. They had unveiled the puppeteer behind Dalton, but confronting Wallace would mean facing the most powerful figure in the county. Jack secured the clerk in custody and delivered him into protective hands, warning that Wallace would stop at nothing to silence loose ends. Driving back through Riverside, Jack saw City Hall's lights glowing against the night sky, a beacon of authority hiding rot beneath. He tightened his grip on the wheel, aware that the final confrontation would demand more than proof. It would demand the strength to stand against a man who had mastered deception for decades. Duke rested his head against Jack's knee, eyes steady, as if reminding him that loyalty remained stronger than betrayal. The revelation that Commissioner Henry Wallace stood behind the web of corruption left Jack Miller with a hollow weight in his chest. All along, the commissioner had worn the mask of integrity, offering condolences, standing tall at Robert Carter's funeral, pretending to mourn while quietly orchestrating the chief's downfall. Jack knew Wallace would not wait idly for evidence to spread. He returned to Linda Carter's house that night with Duke at his side, determined to keep her safe. Linda was pale but resolute, sitting near Robert's empty armchair, as though drawing strength from its familiar presence. Susan stayed close to her sister, her son now under protective watch, far from Riverside. Jack explained what he had learned at the abandoned mill. His words measured the truth, falling heavy. Linda listened without interruption, only tightening her grip on Duke's collar when Jack said Wallace's name. She whispered that Robert had once trusted Wallace more than any other official, that betrayal of such magnitude would have shattered him. Jack promised her they would see justice carried through. The following day, Jack and Reynolds met with federal agents to prepare a warrant for Wallace's arrest. They cataloged the evidence, the safe deposit files, the ledger, the recordings of Dalton's calls, and now the testimony of Dalton's aide. But Jack warned that Wallace's power meant danger would come before morning. His words proved true sooner than expected. That evening, as Linda prepared tea in her kitchen and Jack reviewed files at the dining table, Duke lifted his head, suddenly, ears pricked, growl low and steady. Jack stood instantly, his hand moving toward his weapon. The back door creaked open, though it had been locked moments before. Two masked figures slipped in, moving with practiced silence, blades glinting in the dim light. One moved toward the kitchen, where Linda stood frozen, the other toward Jack. Duke launched himself forward, his body a blur of tan and black, striking the first intruder with such force that the man crashed against the counter. The knife clattered across the floor. Jack fired a warning shot into the ceiling, ordering the second man to drop his weapon, but the attacker lunged. They collided against the table files, scattering like leaves. Linda screamed, but before the assailant could raise his blade, Duke returned, blood already marking his flank from the first struggle. The dog sank his teeth into the man's arm, holding him long enough for Jack to disarm him and pin him to the ground. The first intruder staggered to his feet, but Linda struck him with the kettle she still clutched, buying Jack the moment he needed to subdue both. When the sirens arrived minutes later, the assassins lay bound on the floor, Duke panting heavily, his side bleeding freely. Jack knelt beside him, pressing his hand against the wound, whispering steady words of praise and comfort. Duke's eyes stayed fixed on Linda Tail, thumping weakly as if assuring her she was safe. At the hospital, veterinarians worked through the night while Jack paced the waiting hall, his shoulder sore from the fight, his thoughts sharp with anger. Reynolds entered with grim news. Both captured men confessed they were sent directly by Wallace, promised money and protection if they silenced Jack and Linda before the evidence could be released. The testimony, coupled with all the documents, left no room for doubt. At dawn, federal agents descended upon Wallace's estate. The commissioner attempted calm denial, but the weight of evidence was overwhelming. He was led away in handcuffs, his face pale, his composure cracked at last. The news rippled through Riverside like a cleansing storm. Dalton, stripped of protection, agreed to cooperate, confirming Wallace's role in the embezzlement of federal redevelopment funds and the attempted murder of Robert Carter. Days later, Robert, still fragile but improving, opened his eyes long enough to hear that Wallace was behind bars. He squeezed Linda's hand faintly, and she whispered through tears that the truth had survived because loyalty had endured. When Duke was finally released from veterinary care, the town gathered at the courthouse square for a quiet ceremony. Jack stood in uniform, his arm still bandaged, as Reynolds presented him with a federal commendation for courage. But the loudest applause came when Duke trotted forward, his limp slight, but his eyes bright, a medal fastened to his collar. Linda knelt to embrace the dog, whispering that he had carried Robert's spirit when all else had failed. Jack looked across the crowd and saw hope flickering in faces that had once carried suspicion and despair. Riverside was scarred, but standing its deepest betrayal brought into light. He rested his hand on Duke's head, feeling the steady strength beneath the fur. In that moment, Jack understood that justice was not carried only in courts and files, but in the loyalty that refused to break even under shadows. The conspiracy had collapsed, Wallace's mask torn away, but what endured was simpler and stronger, the bond between man community and the dog who had refused to let truth die. Thank you for staying with me through this story of loyalty, betrayal, and truth uncovered. What part of the story struck you the most? The loyal dog's warning, the hidden evidence, or the final confrontation? I'd love to hear your thoughts and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. If you'd like more stories like this, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next.